Yeah, so David, thanks for your time. I've remembered you emerging into this API scene, at least from my knowledge, for at least 8 years. And I remember hearing about what you've been doing. We might have even bumped into each other at a bunch of conferences. So maybe just start with your history around the space and tell us what you're up to.
Sure. So my co-founder and I have been working APIs for 8 or 9 years. Originally, we were looking at it from a gateway perspective and integrating into different API stacks. And about 6 years ago, that led us to realize that we had zero idea whether the APIs we worked with worked. And it came to a head with a client we were consulting for that their marketing team didn't know whether the APIs they were trying to sell worked. And DevOps internally in the company was saying everything's fine, and developers were telling them that their stuff was crap and they were using Twilio instead. So we realized that there was a gap in the instrumentation market, and we hit upon the same concept that John Musser did at API Science, that John Sheehan did at RunScope, and coming out from a slightly different direction, Abhinav Avista at Postman, and also Patrick Pullen at API Fortress. We all centered on the fact that there needed to be a new class of API tools. And I think where we slightly diverged about 4 years ago is we realized that the problem wasn't necessarily testing APIs. There were lots of solutions for that. And frankly, everybody was using Postman anyway. But there was a real question about what the data told you. And we've been like pack rats with our data. We're obviously a much smaller company than Postman, but we've got something like 5 to 6 times as much data under management. And we've never thrown away an API call. We've got stored metadata of every API transaction made to our product. And we started to realize that there was no real way of agreeing what was good or bad in the API sector. And this is something I've been saying at conferences for you've probably seen one of my talks 4 or 5 years now, of APIs they're almost like quantum physics. They could be up and down at the same time. And two businesses looking at the same API can have wildly different views of how they work. And what we wanted to come up with was, well, how do you address the question of quality? And how do you come up with something that allows non-engineers to actually understand what's going on with critical systems? And as APIMetrics has evolved, particularly as open API standards have become essential in sectors like travel and finance and healthcare, there's actually a requirement for non-engineering monitoring or monitoring that tells business owners and business leaders what they're missing and what they need to know in case of a regulatory dispute, or just to be sure that they're offering a service that's comparable to a competitor. The way we see it with the regulators that we work with in fintech is, how do they regulate a dispute where both parties can prove the other one is wrong? And one of the challenges with the existing DevOps tooling and DevOps monitoring is both groups can come with receipts to prove the other one is not telling the truth. But the truth exists. There will be a reason for it, but it may not be anybody's particular fault. It might just be an architectural issue, a cross-cloud problem. But we started realizing that's where we wanted to be and what we wanted to focus on. And that's where APIMetrics is being utilized now.
That's interesting because, when we think of health of an API, at least at runtime, we're talking about, the response, we're talking about, 200 responses, we're talking about maybe SLA metrics. So just paint a picture of me at a high level. What are the different other axes that you may look at apart from what I just said?
So you picked a good one to start with. And there's been gentle ribbing between myself and John Sheehan for years on this, which is 200 okay is not always okay. So one of the classic examples we see is the API passes with a 200, but it doesn't return data. So it just returns either empty brackets or 0. But the API passed. So if you're just looking at pass-fail rates, that was a valid API call. If you were expecting something, it's a complete failure. But as far as your gateway metrics are concerned and you're concerned, it was probably a pass. So that's one area. Very slow passes are another one. Inconsistent APIs. So I think we actually, when we were seeing this, we turned off our timeouts. Our world record for a pass was 25 minutes from a particular service. that it just sat there, and eventually 25 minutes later, it remembered it had a session open and sent one back. So you can get some very, if you don't shut down the connection, you can get some very extreme passing events. Inconsistency of response times is another issue. It's actually easy to build for a slow API. You can design UI to cope with slow. If your UI is usually very fast, but then goes through periods where it's extremely slow, you can't build easily for that, because people expect a certain response time. And then if it spends 3 or 4 hours a day running at 2 minutes, people will just get bored and tired of the app. But often what we found with our customers is that's not very well logged in their existing systems, because a lot of people still rely on medians rather than percentiles for DevOps purposes. And you can hide pretty much anything you like in a median. We actually had a carrier customer who had a service out for 6 hours a day, but because the average response time didn't change, as far as they were concerned, they were within their SLA, but nobody could use the service for 6 hours. And that's the kind of thing which we've started to realize when you get into SLAs becomes a real challenge for people, because you need to have SLAs that both parties not only agree on, but they can both measure in a consistent way, so that when they have a dispute, they are measuring the same thing. If you're providing an SLA, but you only ever measure at your gateway, nobody can ever prove you're wrong. Even if they can't use your service, you will be able to state, subject to the SLA, nothing has gone wrong. And personally, one of my problems with the industry at the moment is we are basically hand waving away SLAs. We should take them a lot more seriously, especially as we move into an era of open finance, open travel. What SLAs and what will be the enforcement on COVID passports, for example, your COVID vaccination status. If you can't book an airline ticket without one, and that service is running slowly, that will have real world implications. But how do you prove that to a third party? And that's where we're going.
Right. Now, we are now increasingly moving into a multi-tenant, multi-cloud hybrid world where there's APIs, under APIs, under APIs, and it's all nested. There's proprietary APIs hidden underneath more proprietary or public APIs, and there's Kubernetes APIs and your whole Kubernetes stack, and then you have other APIs on top for your application layer. So how do you think about API health and API in this world? So much complexity.
So we were the first solution. I think we're still the only solution that's multi-cloud, multi-tenant. A lot of solutions out there are predominantly built on one cloud, be it usually AWS. We took the view that your API, you can't guarantee APIs are built on AWS. So our system currently, everywhere there's a public data set, oh, excuse me, a public data center from Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, and Google, we have a data collection agent. And you need to think about agent network like mini application servers. So if you look at a fintech solution doesn't speak to your mobile phone app contacting a bank. It doesn't speak direct to your bank. Because of the security layers, it's actually speaking to an intermediate server that's handling the secure communications to the banks, often through an aggregator in this multi-cloud world. So actually what you're interested in is how well those connections are working in the cloud. So we allow people to monitor simultaneously from every data center around the world and around the cloud. So you can actually see some of these container-based problems where Cloud X doesn't speak to Cloud Y very well, or you have a transitory DNS problem. It's 2021, and a lot of problems still resolve down to DNS. And when you drill into it, it turns out that somebody in the engineering infrastructure team just didn't know how their CDN, like Akamai, works. So they put a CDN in place on their domain, and everything on their website resolves in 4 milliseconds. And you can see that, and we can test that. But their APIs take anything up to a second to resolve. And it's purely because the person doing the work didn't know that api.domain.com resolves differently with their CDN than domain.com. And there's little things like that we still people are making mistakes with and missing. And that just adds time and clunkiness to the solutions.
Right. So now if I'm an enterprise, if I'm a bank, right, or a large enterprise, chances are I'm in vendor relationships with a MuleSoft, an Apigee, a Kong, an Amazon gateway, maybe some other proprietary and open source gateway. So it's one thing to have metrics and measurements at those levels, but there is no overarching layer that can then be the metrics and the measurement for the API of all APIs, and including public APIs and other APIs that are not within those little halos of those other vendors.
No, and that's one of the challenges people are seeing, that the gateway logs, and some of the gateway vendors are better at recognizing this than others, but there is a reliance on the gateway being the single source of truth. The gateway is only the source of truth as to what goes through the gateway. And if we look at banking, which is an interesting example, I like to use the phrase computational archaeology. If you're dealing with a bank, say an old established British bank, they will have IT infrastructure that's still running, that was probably put in place when I was at primary school. That there will be a mainframe that they bought in the early 70s or even in the 60s, when I was not even born, I hasten to say. But they will have something running, something that will be connected via a chain of internal systems, eventually arriving at a MuleSoft or an Apigee that serves the JSON through a REST API. And what we see time and time again for the banks is the gateway ignores 400 errors because they're nothing to do with it. But they go all the way out to an application and just say, nope, that service isn't available. And there's nothing in the DevOps chain between that 1973 IBM mainframe and somebody's app on their iPhone in 2021 that actually is picking up that that's gone wrong. And that we see this, we actually see it over and over again with customers where they just don't realize that a service has been taken down, and they've tuned out the errors because they're always someone else's problem. And we want a holistic view of these DevOps chains to exist, because at some point somebody has to actually sign up for this stuff and put their name against it. But also, if they're connecting to these third-party services, if Bank X is down and you have a banking aggregation service and you're trying to transfer account data, and your logo is on an app, they don't care that the other bank is down. They see your logo. And that is something I think people are only just waking up to now, 3-4 years into mass API adoption and banking. This isn't just about, are we up or not? It's about, what is the impact on your brand? Can you defend yourself against lawsuits to regulators? Do you actually know what's going on that could impact your users? And I think what I'm trying to figure out, and this is a question I wanted to ask you, is what do we call the people who are the consumers of the APIs, but not just the person on the end of the iPhone, the CISO, the CIO, the open banking manager, or the open healthcare manager inside a large hospital network? What do we call them? We've got lots of solutions for developers, but we don't have a good, we can say that Postman is the solution place that developers should be. But what about the people the developers are building for? What do we call them? And I'm not sure we have a good answer for that, and I'd love to hear one.
Yeah, I don't have an answer either, because it's so funny. We all talk about the business of APIs, and APIs becoming a quote unquote business conversation. And we talk about design first and having a functionally driven design scope to APIs. But yeah, that's where we stop. We kind of say, okay, let's design our APIs with the business in mind, and then we fall off a cliff, and we hand it over to the technical and the developers and people that are using Postman and whatnot. You're right. There is no coming back home and saying, okay, so this is what we're designed for you. Now here is your informed dashboard and insight place. I have not seen anything that can bubble it up. Like, I could just imagine if Plaid, which is aggregating a bunch of banks' APIs, if they could provide architects and business owners within the banks an API dashboard for them, that would be very interesting. And I haven't seen that. So yeah.
So that is so to close the loop. That's where that's where we've ended up, and that's what we're building, and that's what we're releasing this month. Because the Plaids of the world and others, even the banks, if the banks work with a bunch of payment service providers, They want to know that the service is going to work when they batch a process and attach the APIs. And at the moment, they don't really know that for sure. Sure, you can go to a status page, but actually status page is not always true. It's what you're reporting is not actually based on, yes, 30 seconds ago, a call completed and this API worked from AWS Frankfurt where you're based. And that's actually what somebody who has a solution talking to a major bank wants to know. They don't want to know that there are no reported incidents. They want to know that if they serve a batch of 100,000 API calls in 1 minute's time, will they execute and will they complete? Because is the service responding to our data center? And what we're doing is we're exposing new levels of dashboards and new data that everybody can share and have transparent visibility on. And that's what I think the industries need is open, honest, transparent data on how services work that everybody can agree is, yeah, that's what it looks like, rather than what we have at the moment, which is engineering pass, devs pass to DevOps, and DevOps look at what they can provide, and they provide what they can provide, not what they should measure.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's. I'm very curious to see the product that you have, and please go ahead and give us like a little demo. I'm excited to see it.
Sure. Love to. So this is a service we launched last year. It's free at the moment. This is free and always will be. And you can think of it as a directory of a curated collection of APIs with meaningful data associated with it. So the landing category is corporate infrastructure. This is basically the top 20 APIs everybody uses day to day. We have links to the developer sites. You can see at a glance if they've had problems in the last week, if failures have occurred. But what we're looking at is we're doing actual calls against live production accounts every typically 5 minutes from different data centers around the world in the cloud. And then we're blending that data together to form a pattern of how good the API is. So if you think about
the frequency of calls you're making, is that configurable?
Yeah, you can set it to whatever you like. We found, to be honest, for what we do, it doesn't need to be super high frequency, and you're not trying to break the service. You're trying to build up a random pattern of performance. And what we do is because we're a cloud agnostic platform, we're up on all of the data centers for the 4 major clouds. We're working on getting up on Alibaba. We also have for customers specialist data centers in hard to reach locations. So we do monitor from China for certain customers, New Zealand and others. The key thing we realized very early on, though, was you could look at a metric like pass rate, you could look at latency, and in and of themselves, you could say, I've got a great latency, my API is fantastic, or we have a great pass rate, our API is fantastic. But it doesn't tell the whole story. So we created a system that we've patented called CASC, and it stands for Cloud API Service Consistency. What we do there is we blend all the metrics together using some AI tools we've built using Donut and some other technologies to detect outliers. And what we're looking for is how consistent is the response to your API. So yes, we look at, did it pass? And not just did it give a 200, but did it give you what you expected? Because we get quite a lot of 200 failures. And then was the median consistent, or was in fact it all over the place and very spiky? So this allows us to do pretty much like for like comparisons between different APIs. And the good news for big corporate APIs from companies know what they're doing is they're all pretty good. We say anything above an 8 is good, anything above 9 is very good. And we very rarely see these APIs dip. They are consistent, they are well built. But you'll notice they don't always have 100% uptimes. Some are 4 nines, some are 3 nines, some are only 2 nines. And on our free site, you can look at the last week, the last month, or even go and look at all of 2020's data.
What I find interesting is your CASC metric, because you're right, like it is a very regular habit for people to measure API health by technical metrics like performance, latency, response time, etc. But this, interestingly, for me, is like a composition of metrics, right? Is that what it is? Like
Yeah, I think of it more like a credit score than necessarily just a
so,
single metric.
so for example, if I'm a bank, one of the things that I also care about is business impact. And so this could be uh, an interesting derivation could be to go towards business impact when you're measuring. So that's interesting.
So we're working on some extensions to the product to allow you to import metadata from all your transactions, so you could blend it with poor performance from different locations. So if you know you had 25,000 calls from a location that's slow, you know what the impact of that is. If
Okay.
you only had 10 calls, you'll be able to say, well, that's not that important.
Right. So this is cool because it's public. It's based on public APIs, and I'm looking at there's a bunch of bank APIs here. So I'm assuming that you have called into bank API calls, actual bank API calls.
Yes, this is a really interesting data set and something we're looking to push, create and curate more of. These are actual UK open banking API calls we've done in conjunction with a partner, Fractal Labs. UK open banking is extremely secure. It uses multi-part authentication, OAuth plus a one-time issued JSON signing certificate that's then has to be kept in an encrypted store. It's very hard to actually make calls, and we've been through the process of onboarding 30 plus institutions so we can monitor at the very least their consent flows. And where you see a little green person here, we're actually monitoring a bank account. So we've got a bank account that we are going and looking at. They call them the AISP calls, but they're the first layer of account information. But this is an interesting data set because these are all the same. Essentially, they're all the same API.
That's interesting. So you could actually have a vertical benchmark. You could have a banking benchmark, banking industry.
We know exactly what they are. They're all the same. They're regulated to be the same. They have metrics that they must achieve. And yet the quality range is quite spectacular. So everything from a 4.8 for creation cards on their authentication server through to Danske Bank, who is solidly in the 9s.
Let's go, Danske. All right, Danska's got their stuff together.
They have, but Creation is an interesting one. So Creation offers store cards. Their authentication server is very unreliable as we measure it. We get a lot of outliers, a lot of performance drift, but their actual APIs are pretty good. I think I just saw them here. Yeah, they're at 13 out of 40.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
So this is a great example of where they're probably missing the problems, because if you just look at the data that they will see, everything is fine. People actually making queries against the production APIs, everything's going well. The fact is, though, it's 5% of the time you have a really crappy experience signing into the service through the API. And that's a problem. These are the problems that tend to get missed with APIs.
Yes. Yes.
And then what we can do is, actually, I'll pick another example because we know roughly what the issue is here. So if I go and look at BBank, I'm not sure who BBank are, but you'll see we have a 30% outlier rate. And what is happening is we actually are having a lot of slow calls from different data centers, except for IBM Cloud. And we've informed them of this, that there's something misconfigured, that 50% of their calls work if they're from AWS, Azure, or Google, but the other 50% kind of get stuck in an InfoSec loop. But again, if you're not looking from the outside in across multiple clouds, you will not see these problems. Everything will look fine from the point of view of your gateway.
Right.
Apogee, MuleSoft, whomever will say, no, everything's fine. Right. This is the kind of thing that the outside-in approach gives you. So this is free data. Anybody can go and look at it. But what we're about to launch as a paid service that anybody can have is essentially APIMetrics for the data sets, but actually getting into the meat behind it. So you'll actually be able to look at how we generated the data and go into a particular account. So you could go into an Adobe, you could go into Microsoft Graph, and what I'll do is quickly just go to an account. You will actually be able to go into this is Microsoft Office 365, but you actually be able to see the domains that are being called. You'll be able to see the actual calls themselves. You'll even be able to go into our statistical engine and see how the cast score is generated and see what could be done to improve things or why we're marking things down. You won't be able to get to you won't be able to get to anything that gives away trade secrets. You won't be able to get to individual results, but you'll be able to see trend analysis and data on a huge variety of APIs that you may rely on or work with, all coming in through a single interface from the API Expert platform. So this is where we're going, and it's the first part of a series of tools we're calling it. We're probably going to call something around like Observant. But the idea is it's to give non-engineers full transparency and observability into their DevOps stack, not just for their own products, but all the products they rely on need to have an SLA on or could potentially impact their business. And that's what we're trying to bring essentially out of engineering and into the boardroom.
Yeah, I like it. And so let's talk architecture for a second, a little technical. But if
Sure.
I'm a bank or if I'm an enterprise, I have workloads on various clouds. I have workloads on premise. I have workloads on hyperconverged infrastructure, et cetera. Maybe some partner organizations have workloads. And so I want to, and my application footprint is spread across all of that. So there's going to have to be different flexibility in deployment models. And so talk to me about deploying this to accommodate for a hybrid multi-cloud environment.
So to a certain extent, we're treating all of the APIs we call as a black box. They are, the endpoint is the discrete node that we're going for. So our system doesn't work. It doesn't work out of the box for in-house only resources. So you can't go in and type localhost and set up a call. And that was something it took us a long time to understand about the mindset of developers, that we were shocked to find how many developers had never made a call to their API resource from outside their desktop. So there's a lot of inexperience, even in development communities, around how API security works. So that's one thing. One thing we do is we force people to, can you actually call your service from outside? Our system is cloud-based. We have a single data center where everything gets stored and analyzed at the moment. We can redeploy that for GDPR requirements or other local needs to a particular geography or a particular location. But if you're talking about analyzing where the data comes from, we run 85 at the moment different data center on 85 different data centers. Now, our agent's like a mini application server. So when you set up your call or series of calls, it and schedule it to run on a regular basis, it randomly gets sent out to that data center, queued up, it goes off and executes the call, and then it sends back the data to our AI and ML systems to analyze it and produce the statistical models for it. So to a certain extent, we're completely agnostic about where you are and how you're built, but we can do interesting things like tell you where in the world is fastest. So we can actually say, at the moment, anybody calling you from AWS Virginia gets 300 milliseconds better performance than AWS California. And that's the kind of thing that's also very hard for people to see, because there's a lot of focus in cloud monitoring tools on cost, but very little on, well, what does that do to my latency? So people will move a Kubernetes implementation to save 5 cents an instance by going to Chicago. But what if that costs you 120 milliseconds per transaction? Was it worth the 5 cents per instance to slow everything down by 100 milliseconds? And these are the questions I don't think people are asking yet, because they're just not thinking of them. But our system's designed to allow you to echo what's happening in the real multi-cloud, multi-homed world.
Yeah, and what I like is that you're hovering above different vendor, the gateways, different vendor specific silos,
and load balancers.
You're abstracting above and load balancers, so that's cool. So then tell me, who is the audience of your product, and where can this go in the future in terms of business conversations, like in business applicability? Yeah.
So most of our customers are actually engineering managers outside of the the day-to-day delivery chain of building an API. I'd say less than 10% of our customers are actually day-to-day developers of APIs. Most of our customers are their bosses or their boss's boss or their boss's boss's boss. And we need to come up for a word for these people. But they're heads of open banking. They are CIOs. They are global infrastructure managers. They are CTO office. They are digital transformation leaders. And we have a non-trivial number who are customer success managers, because they feel the pain of being caught between DevOps and customers. And nobody really wants to be told that there's a problem by a customer, turn around to DevOps and ask what the problem is and be told there's no problem. And that's that's kind of core to what we're seeing is we need to come up industry-wide with a way of describing these API consumers who are actually paying for the services to be built. It's almost like they are paying people to make the sausage, but they want to eat the sausage, and they don't really care how it was made.
Yeah.
And we look after the people making the sausages and cooking them, but the people in the restaurant tend to get what they're given. And I think we need to change that and come up with ways of handling that process.
Yeah, the analog that comes to my mind is, the people that are paying, they, if you were to look at product development, they are specifying the Jira stories. After that, engineers go and make it. Engineers have their own metrics, but it comes back to, tracking your progress in product development on Jira. And a similar in the API world, it goes straight to engineers doing their tracking, but there are no equivalent of business stories around API. So I can see what you're saying. So that makes a lot of sense.
And I think if you look at the world up until very recently, that was fine for how people consumed APIs. But now you have regulators who are actually saying, well, your service must meet this. We are regulating that your service must work this way. And they are having disputes between parties who both say the other is lying and somebody is not. And then we look at things that are emerging in the future. Post-COVID travel will be reliant on rapid ability to get access to people's passport status, their COVID vaccination status, and have trusted metrics that can be delivered in real time when someone's crossing a border, when they're trying to book an airline ticket. Now, there are ways that this could be done with blockchain, but at some point, there will be queries of real-time information that needs to be updated, and that has to work. And everybody has to know if it doesn't.
Opportunities that if you're CIO and you are running an API program, what would your top 2 or 3 things advice you'd give to a CIO right now?
The top one would be independent verification of the things you depend on and you build. So one is to always have somebody who doesn't work for you verify things work. And the second one is to monitor everything you consume from the point of view of where you consume it from, and not inside your systems or be told via status page how something's working. So trust but verify. The second piece is to really start to think about what you expect from an SLA. I think in the tech sector in general, we do very great disservice to ourselves with how we treat SLAs. It's almost impossible to prove an SLA outage unless it was essentially front page of the New York Times. If Amazon goes down and takes out all of the AWS instances on the West Coast or the East Coast, yes, you'll be able to prove that. If you've got problems with Amazon and it's not delivering, you will almost certainly not be able to prove there was an outage. And that's got to change. These are business critical services. We need to have common language, we need to have common standards, and we need to have common agreements on what that means. And if I was a CIO, I'd be demanding not just from my engineering groups, but all the companies that we do business with and we interact with, to have transparency on that data. If you read a lot of EULAs for API use, they will state categorically you should not benchmark or otherwise monitor our service. And that cannot be allowed to stand. You can't buy something or rely on something that has absolutely nothing behind it. Used cars come with more guarantees than that. So what I'm suggesting to CIOs, and what I want a bigger conversation in the industry around, and I'm actually keen to try and lead that, is we need to have some conversations about what the non-technical metrics of APIs are. We have the Open API standard, the Linux Foundation run that. That tells us what we specify, but how we measure it, how we agree on what's good or what's not, and how we should test things. We're not having those conversations. Everyone's doing their own thing. And I'm afraid I have to say, APIs are too critical to too many industries now. Just leave it like that. So I think there needs to be some very serious conversations between serious CIOs on, yeah, we need to actually take some serious thoughts on this.